I'm a 27-year-old guy, and this all started when I moved out of my parents' house into my own apartment a little over a year ago. Like a lot of families, mine can be a bit overprotective. They've always insisted they're just looking out for me, but even as a grown man, it sometimes felt like they wanted to keep an eye on every step I took. So, when they insisted on installing a security system in my apartment, I didn't really think too much of it. My mom pushed it hard, saying it was for my safety. She seemed genuinely worried, and my dad backed her up, talking about how it would help them sleep at night knowing I was secure. I figured why not? It seemed harmless enough. The device itself was one of those all-in-one security systems with a camera, motion sensors, and remote access. They even paid for it and had it professionally installed, which honestly felt like a nice gesture. I didn't exactly want to say no to free security, and the setup looked decent. The system would send alerts to my phone whenever someone came to the door or there was unusual activity in the apartment. At first, I even appreciated it. I could check the camera feed while I was at work or out of town, and it gave me a sense of security, especially living alone. But then little things started to feel off. It started subtly. During one family dinner, my mom casually asked me how my new job project was going, mentioning specifics that I hadn't even told her about. I figured I must have mentioned it in passing or maybe my sister overheard something, but it was strange. Then, one night, my sister asked me about a friend who had visited. Now, this friend isn't someone I'm close with, and I didn't tell anyone they were coming over. My sister's exact words were, "How's your friend? The one with the blue hat?" I froze. There was no way they could have known, unless they'd seen him. But I brushed it off, telling myself I was just overthinking things. It wasn't long after that when I started piecing things together. Every time I left my apartment, I'd get a text from my mom or dad asking where I was going or reminding me to be safe. It was like clockwork. If I went out late, my phone would light up with messages from my family asking if I was okay. One night, I decided to test it. I left my apartment late, didn't tell anyone where I was going, and drove around the block before coming back. Within minutes, my mom texted, "Are you going out somewhere?" That's when I started to realize that the security system wasn't just for my safety, it was for them to keep tabs on me. So I decided to dig into the system settings to see if there was any way they could actually be tracking me. What I found was disturbing. Not only did they have full access to the camera feed and notifications, but they were receiving every single alert that was sent to my phone. Every time I walked in or out, they got a notification. Every time I brought someone over, they knew. But it didn't stop there. I saw that they had access to audio recordings too. There were several logs showing audio was accessed remotely, sometimes at odd hours. My family had been listening in on conversations I had in my own home. After seeing this, I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. It's one thing to have a security camera, but listening in on my private conversations, that felt like a complete invasion. I decided to confront my sister first because I figured she might let something slip. When I brought it up, she tried to act clueless, but she let slip something that confirmed everything she mentioned, that they were just making sure I was okay. That was all I needed to hear. She tried to backtrack, saying it was out of concern and that I was overreacting, but I knew now that my family had been spying on me. I went back to the system settings and pulled up as much history as I could. It showed logs of both video and audio access stretching back to almost the day I'd moved in. They hadn't just been watching, they'd been listening to everything. The privacy I thought I had in my own home was nothing but an illusion. It was hard to process. I sat on this information for a few days trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to just cut them off completely, change the locks, and get a new system without telling them. But another part of me felt betrayed in a way that I couldn't ignore. They'd taken something as personal as my privacy and twisted it under the excuse of safety. It made me question every conversation we'd had since I moved out, every time they'd asked about my life. Had they already known everything before I even told them? In the end, I decided enough was enough. This wasn't just about a security system, it was about control. They wanted to keep tabs on me like I was still a kid, like they had a right to know everything I did. I knew I had to confront them, and I had to take back my own life. But I wasn't sure how they'd react, and honestly, that scared me more than anything. I had no idea what kind of response to expect. But one thing was certain: I wasn't going to keep living with them monitoring my every move. Update 1. After figuring out my family was spying on me through my own security system, I knew I couldn't just let it slide. The next weekend, I went over to my parents' house to confront them. I didn't want to do this over the phone. I wanted to see their faces, see how they'd react when I laid out what I'd found. As soon as I walked in, my mom greeted me with a big smile and asked if I was doing okay. I went straight to the point, saying I knew about the device and how they'd been using it to track my movements and listen in. My parents looked at each other, clearly caught off guard. My dad shifted uncomfortably in his chair, while my mom's smile faded as she mumbled something about just wanting to protect me. They tried to act like it was all innocent, saying the device was only installed for my safety. My mom went on about how the world is dangerous and how they'd sleep better at night knowing I was okay. But the more they talked, the more it felt like they were dodging the issue. My sister, who had been sitting quietly up until then, jumped in to defend them. She said they were just looking out for me and that I was making a big deal out of nothing. When I told them that my privacy wasn't something they could just overlook, my mom's face dropped. She started pulling out all the worried parent lines. She told me they'd done so much to make sure I was safe and that I should be grateful. My dad added that they didn't mean any harm, they were only trying to help. They insisted I was overreacting and being unreasonable. I didn't let up. I told them that spying on me wasn't normal, and that I was planning to change the device settings to remove their access. My mom's expression immediately changed to one of pure panic. She started talking about how dangerous it would be if they couldn't keep an eye on things. My dad backed her up, saying it was reckless and irresponsible to shut them out when they were only trying to keep me safe. The guilt trip was intense, but I stood firm, telling them it wasn't their decision to make. The confrontation didn't go well, and they wouldn't back down. My mom started crying, asking me why I would cut them off like this after everything they'd done for me. She brought up times they'd helped me, saying I was being ungrateful. My sister kept throwing in comments about how I was making everyone worry unnecessarily. The whole conversation felt twisted, like they were turning the blame on me for wanting my own space. When I got home, I called a friend and told him everything. He was shocked and suggested that I consider going no contact until my family respected my boundaries. It sounded drastic, but I was starting to think he was right. I decided to change my home security system entirely. I didn't want to risk them finding a way around it, so I got a new system and made sure they had zero access. I didn't tell them about it. I just quietly cut them off from my security feed and went about my life. As expected, my phone started blowing up. My parents and sister sent messages constantly, asking me if I was safe, telling me how worried they were, and trying to guilt me for shutting them out. They called at all hours, acting like my silence was some kind of crisis. My mom even sent me messages hinting that I was putting myself in danger without them watching over me. Soon after, my sister began sending these passive-aggressive texts. She'd say things like, "It's a shame you don't care about your safety anymore," or "Guess you don't need family when you've got all the privacy you want." It was clear they were trying to make me feel bad for setting boundaries. At first, their comments got to me. I couldn't help but wonder if I'd overreacted by cutting them off. But every time I thought about the audio logs and the extent of their surveillance, I knew I'd made the right call. My friend reassured me, reminding me that I had every right to feel safe and private in my own home. He pointed out that my family's reaction only proved they didn't respect my boundaries, so I resolved to stand firm. They'd crossed a line, and I wasn't going to just go back to letting them control my life. Since blocking their access to my security system, I felt hyper-aware of any signs they might still be keeping tabs on me. I found myself double-checking my phone and any shared accounts to make sure there weren't other ways they could track me. This experience made me question everything, and I became more vigilant than ever. It was exhausting, but I felt it was necessary to fully reclaim my independence. Despite the barrage of texts and calls, I stayed resolute. I ignored the guilt-tripping, the passive-aggressive comments, and the emotional manipulation. It wasn't easy, but I knew I had to draw a line. My privacy wasn't something to be bargained with. I deserved to live without feeling like I was constantly being watched. In the end, I came to a solid conclusion: my family's boundaries, or lack of them, were the real problem. I couldn't keep sacrificing my peace of mind just to make them comfortable. It was time for me to take control of my life on my own terms. Update 2. It wasn't long after cutting my family off from my security system that they took things up a notch. One Saturday morning, I was lounging around in my apartment when I heard a knock on the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and when I looked through the peephole, there were my parents standing outside with worried expressions. My mom had this intense look, while my dad stood behind her, arms crossed like he was prepared for a confrontation. I opened the door, and before I could even say anything, my mom launched into a monologue about how they hadn't heard from me, how they were worried sick, and how my sudden change in behavior was scaring them. They just walked right in, looking around like they were expecting to see some dramatic reason for why I'd decided to block them out of my life. When I told them they needed to respect my boundaries, my mom's face went pale and she started crying, asking why I was treating them this way. She talked about how they'd only ever wanted to protect me and that I was acting like they were strangers. My dad, on the other hand, looked around the apartment, barely even glancing at me. Then, out of nowhere, they started blaming my friend. They said he'd been a bad influence on me and had changed me. They claimed he'd brainwashed me into turning against them, as if I couldn't make decisions on my own. Then came the financial threat. My mom, still in her emotional tone, reminded me that they'd helped with some of my expenses over the years. She hinted that if I was going to act like this, I couldn't expect them to keep supporting me. My dad finally spoke up, saying they couldn't keep throwing money at someone who didn't respect them. That one hit a nerve, but I quickly realized something that made me feel strangely calm. I didn't rely on them financially anymore. I'd been on my own, working hard to build a life without their help, so I wasn't scared of losing any financial support. I told them that, letting them know I didn't need their money and wasn't going to let it control me. That only made my mom's emotional manipulation worse. She started talking about how they'd sacrificed for me, how they'd always been there for me, and that this was how I was repaying them. She said I was acting like a stranger, and if I didn't let them help me, then I would lose my family entirely. She even called it an ultimatum. I stood my ground and said that my privacy wasn't negotiable, no matter what they threatened to take away. I think she realized at that point that I wasn't backing down, but she kept up the guilt trip, reminding me of all the times they'd protected me growing up, as if that gave them a lifelong right to control me. The conversation was going nowhere, so I firmly told them that they needed to leave if they couldn't respect my boundaries. My dad gave me the silent treatment, his usual tactic when he wanted to guilt me without saying anything. He just stood there, staring, while my mom kept pleading and blaming. Finally, they left, but it wasn't over. Within an hour, my family group chat was buzzing. My parents had posted these cryptic messages about losing a son and how heartbreaking it was to be shut out. My mom even posted a long message about how sometimes, even those you love can turn their backs on you. I could feel the drama brewing. Soon enough, my phone started lighting up with messages from extended family members, cousins, aunts, and uncles, all asking what was going on. Some of them were polite, asking if I was okay, but others immediately took my parents' side, urging me to make peace and not be so harsh. I couldn't handle the constant pressure and decided to block my family members temporarily to clear my head. Even though I knew I was doing what was right for me, it felt surreal. Here I was, just trying to set some boundaries, and it felt like I was being forced into a battle with the people who were supposed to care about me. I wondered how things had gotten so twisted that privacy was now seen as some kind of betrayal. After blocking them, I felt a mixture of relief and a strange sense of guilt. It was like I could finally breathe, but at the same time, there was this nagging worry about the fallout and whether this was the point of no return. I tried to focus on getting back to my routine, but the emotional toll was heavier than I'd expected. Thankfully, I had friends who understood. I leaned on them more, and they were there for me, reminding me that I wasn't wrong for wanting my own space and privacy. They helped me research ways to deal with family boundaries, giving me tools to handle the manipulation and emotional blackmail that I'd been dealing with my whole life. It was comforting to know that I wasn't alone in this and that other people had gone through similar situations. Over the next few days, I slowly began to feel more empowered in my decision. My family had made it clear they weren't going to respect my boundaries unless I took a stand. For once, I felt like I had control over my own life, and even though it came at a price, I was determined not to let them pull me back into their grip. I realized I could have relationships on my terms, even if it meant creating some distance with my family. Moving forward, I knew it was going to be a challenge. I couldn't predict how my family would react to being cut off, but I had reached my limit. This was a line I wasn't going to cross back over. I was done being under their watchful eye, and I was done letting them manipulate me into feeling like I owed them something for just wanting to live my life independently. Update 3. After the last blow-up with my family, I realized that things weren't going to get better on their own. They'd made it clear that my boundaries didn't matter to them, and I knew I couldn't keep living in this constant state of surveillance and manipulation. So, I decided to take things a step further and reached out to a lawyer to see what my options were. When I explained the situation to him, he didn't seem surprised. He'd heard similar stories from others dealing with intrusive family members. He told me that technically what my family had been doing, spying on me through the security device without my consent, wasn't just invasive, it was illegal. He mentioned that I could file a restraining order to formally protect my privacy and set clear legal boundaries. The thought of a restraining order felt extreme, but knowing there was an option gave me a strange sense of relief. I wasn't completely powerless in this. I hadn't planned on telling my family about the consultation, but somehow my sister found out. I'm not sure how, but my guess is she still had ways to keep tabs on me through mutual friends or some other means. Not long after, I received a flood of angry messages from my family. My sister sent a long, angry text accusing me of being dramatic and disloyal. My dad's message was more direct, implying that if I went through with any legal nonsense, they would retaliate. They claimed they were hurt and betrayed by my disrespect, but not once did they acknowledge my reasons for wanting privacy. A few days later, my parents showed up at my apartment again, this time making a full scene. They were loud, and it was clear they wanted everyone in my building to know they were there. My mom was in tears, practically shouting about how I was abandoning my family and how much they'd sacrificed for me. My dad was in the background, arms crossed, looking angry and disappointed, like I was a child who had done something shameful. The neighbors started peeking through their doors, trying to see what was going on. At this point, I realized I couldn't handle this alone. I calmly stepped back inside and called the police, explaining that my parents were causing a disturbance. The police arrived quickly, and I explained the situation. My parents were furious, calling it a betrayal and accusing me of humiliating them in front of the whole building. But I stood my ground. The police asked them to leave, and eventually they did, though not without a final barrage of accusations about how selfish I'd become. Things didn't quiet down after that incident. My sister took to social media, posting vague but clearly directed messages about people who don't appreciate their family and how heartbreaking it is when someone you love turns their back on you. She didn't mention me by name, but anyone who knew us would understand who she was talking about. My extended family, who'd already been bombarding me with messages, started reaching out more. They'd heard a twisted version of the story that painted me as unstable, ungrateful, and disrespectful. It was like my parents were building an army of allies against me. Fortunately, my friends were there for me. They knew the real story and made sure I didn't let the negativity get to me. They reminded me that I wasn't crazy for wanting my own life and my own space. They supported me in setting up new rules around my apartment. I put up signs by my door that clearly stated no entry without permission, just to make sure there was no confusion. I wanted to establish once and for all that my home was my own, and they couldn't just barge in whenever they felt like it. Then, out of the blue, I got a message from my mom. It was almost as if the last few weeks hadn't happened. She wrote that they were willing to forgive me if I apologized and came back to them. It felt surreal reading it, like they thought this was all just a phase, and that I'd be back to playing the obedient son. I didn't respond the way they wanted. Instead, I replied that I had nothing to apologize for, and that I wasn't going to apologize for setting boundaries that they had repeatedly disrespected. After that message, I decided it was time to go fully no contact. I blocked my family across all platforms and let my extended family members know that I needed space and wouldn't be answering messages related to my parents. I didn't make a scene about it, I just quietly disconnected. The drama on their end continued, but without access to me, it slowly started to fade out of my direct line of sight. With the distance, I began to notice changes in myself. My mind felt clearer, and the constant tension I'd been carrying started to lift. I didn't realize how deeply the situation had been affecting me until I stepped away from it. For the first time, I was living without the fear of being watched or controlled, and it felt like a weight had finally been lifted. At the lawyer's recommendation, I decided to go ahead with filing the restraining order. It felt like the final step in protecting myself, legally solidifying the boundaries I'd already tried to set. The process wasn't easy, and part of me felt strange doing it to my own family, but I knew it was necessary. I needed something concrete in place to keep them from escalating even further. Filing the restraining order felt like a closing chapter. It was a way of saying that I was done being pulled back into their drama and control. This time, they couldn't guilt me, manipulate me, or talk me into dropping my boundaries. Update 4. After finalizing the restraining order, I decided it was time to make a real change. I'd spent months dealing with drama, manipulation, and guilt, and I wanted a fresh start, somewhere my family couldn't easily reach. So, I packed up, found a job opportunity in a new city, and moved. I didn't tell anyone in my family where I was going, just a few close friends. For the first time, it felt like I could actually breathe. Settling into my new apartment felt like the start of a new chapter. Without the constant messages, the random visits, or the guilt-inducing phone calls, my mental health started improving almost immediately. I hadn't even realized how much of a toll their interference had taken on me until it was gone. I'd gotten so used to the weight of their expectations that being free of it felt almost surreal. I was able to focus on my new job without the constant worry of being watched or criticized. The job itself was everything I'd hoped for. I'd landed a position that matched my skills and allowed me to grow professionally. With no family drama in the background, I threw myself into work, eager to prove myself. Within a few months, my efforts started paying off. My manager noticed the quality of my work, and I got a promotion. The difference was clear. Without my family's constant interference, I was thriving. Then, just as I was getting comfortable, I received a letter in the mail. It was from my family, forwarded from my old address. I didn't need to open it to know what it would say. Another guilt trip, another plea for forgiveness, another attempt to pull me back. I threw it away without a second thought. They tried sending a few more letters, but I refused to let them drag me back into their world of control and manipulation. Now that I was away from my family's reach, I started dating again. For the first time, I didn't have to worry about my mom interrogating me about every person I spent time with, or my dad's passive-aggressive comments about my choices. I could explore relationships without that constant shadow of judgment hanging over me. I actually got to know people without feeling like I had to keep anything hidden. Occasionally, there were brief moments of doubt. I'd wonder if maybe I'd been too harsh, or if there was a way to rebuild a relationship with my family on my terms. But whenever those thoughts crept in, my friends reminded me of why I'd chosen this path. They helped me see that the boundaries I'd set were for my own well-being and that I wasn't obligated to sacrifice my mental health just to keep my family comfortable. To make sure I was really healing, I started seeing a therapist. Therapy gave me the tools to understand the unhealthy dynamics I'd grown up with and taught me how to avoid falling back into old patterns. My therapist helped me work through the guilt and resentment, and slowly I felt the anger lift. Instead of carrying it around, I was learning to let go. Around that time, I learned from a mutual friend that my family hadn't stopped talking about me. Apparently, they were still spreading their version of the story to anyone who would listen, framing me as the ungrateful son who'd abandoned them. At first, I thought about confronting them again, but then I decided it wasn't worth the energy. I was past the point of caring what they said. I didn't need their approval or validation anymore. As I settled into my new life, I made friends who respected my boundaries and encouraged my independence. I found a social circle where I didn't have to explain myself or constantly justify my choices. These new friends became my support system, helping me move forward. They respected my need for privacy and didn't pry into every aspect of my life, and I realized how rare and valuable that truly was. I also started picking up hobbies I'd always been interested in but never had the space for before. I took up painting and writing, two things I'd always found therapeutic but hadn't felt free to explore with my family watching. I poured my experiences into my art and writing, finding a way to express everything I'd been through. It was like I was reclaiming parts of myself I'd lost over the years. Work continued to go well, and after a few more months, I was promoted again. The feeling of achieving something purely for myself, without anyone holding me back, was incredible. Looking back, I realized just how much my family's negativity had affected my self-worth and career. Now, with them out of the picture, I was reaching my full potential, free from the constraints they'd put on me. Then, one day, I got a message from an old friend back home. She'd heard about everything that had happened and asked if I'd thought about reconnecting with my family. She said they missed me and wondered if I'd consider reaching out to mend things. I didn't even have to think about it. I told her politely that I'd moved on and wasn't interested in rehashing the past. For the first time, I felt no hesitation. I was finally done with that chapter of my life. That evening, I sat down and wrote out everything I'd gone through since setting those boundaries. It was a personal reflection, a way to capture my journey and remind myself how far I'd come. As I wrote, I felt a sense of closure that I hadn't felt before. I was grateful for the freedom I'd fought so hard to create, and I knew that no matter what happened, I was never going back to the life I'd left behind. Update 5. Just as I was settling into my new life, my parents showed up unannounced at my workplace. I hadn't seen or heard from them in months, thanks to the restraining order and going no contact. But here they were, standing in the lobby, clearly determined to talk to me. They must have found out where I worked through some other family member or mutual friend who still had contact with them. The receptionist looked over at me with raised eyebrows, clearly concerned, and I knew this wouldn't be a simple chat. As I walked up to them, my parents immediately started their old routine, talking about how much I'd hurt them by cutting them off. My mom's voice wavered, saying they'd done everything for me, and my dad stood there with a hardened look, arms crossed, as if daring me to ignore them. They didn't care that we were in a public space. They seemed determined to guilt trip me, hoping I'd break. But instead of feeling pressured, I felt an unexpected calm come over me. I calmly told them that if they didn't leave, I would have to call security. My mom looked stunned, and my dad's expression shifted to anger, as if he couldn't believe I was standing my ground. Other employees and a few clients were starting to notice the tension, and I knew I had to end this quickly. When they still wouldn't leave, I told the receptionist to call security. As the guards approached, my parents finally backed off, but not without a final attempt to make a scene. My mom's voice rose, accusing me of abandoning my family and making it clear to everyone in the lobby that I was the ungrateful one. But I didn't flinch. I stayed silent, watching as the guards escorted them out. After they left, a few coworkers came over, asking if I was okay and offering their support. They'd seen enough of the confrontation to understand the basics. It was reassuring to know that, even in a new city, I wasn't alone. My boss pulled me aside later, letting me know that I didn't have to worry about them showing up again. The security team had been notified to keep them out if they tried returning. A few days later, I received another letter from my mom. It was several pages long, filled with all the same phrases she'd used before. How I'd broken the family, how much they'd sacrificed for me, and how all they wanted was a place in my life. She framed it as if my need for privacy was some kind of betrayal, as if I'd chosen to hurt them intentionally. But this time, as I read through the letter, I felt detached. I could see the emotional manipulation for what it was. The words didn't carry the same weight they once did. In my next therapy session, I brought up the letter. My therapist pointed out how my parents were using guilt as a tool to control me, just like they had in the past. This conversation with my therapist helped me understand that their need for control wasn't about love, it was about power. It solidified my decision to stay firm and not let their words sway me. Not long after, I got another letter, this time from my dad. He didn't bother with emotional pleas. Instead, he went straight to an ultimatum. He claimed that unless I reestablished contact, they would cut me out of the will. I almost laughed when I read it. They hadn't financially supported me in years, and I'd worked hard to build my own life, independent of them. The will was the last thing I cared about, and I think they knew that. But the attempt to use money as leverage made it clear they weren't interested in my well-being, just in keeping control. Then my aunt reached out, trying to mediate. She asked if I'd be willing to sit down with my parents and work things out. I appreciated her attempt, but I let her know I needed peace and that I wasn't interested in reconciling under terms that only served my parents. I told her that any contact would have to respect my boundaries, and I wouldn't compromise on that. Surprisingly, my sister also reached out. Unlike my parents, she seemed genuine. She apologized for her part in the past drama and acknowledged that she'd been wrong to take sides. I was cautious, but I told her that if she wanted a relationship, it would have to be on my terms, with full respect for my privacy and independence. She agreed, and we started slowly rebuilding trust. She didn't push or pry, which was a refreshing change. For the first time, I felt like we might be able to have a real relationship based on mutual respect. With each day, I felt more secure in the life I'd built for myself, free from the constant interference that had once felt so normal. I found myself looking forward to the future, knowing it was mine to shape. My life was no longer defined by my family's demands or expectations. I'd set my own boundaries and chosen my own path. One evening, I sat down to journal about everything that had happened, reflecting on the journey I'd been through. From the initial shock of realizing my family had been watching me to the long process of standing up for my independence, it had been a difficult road. But now, looking back, I could see how far I'd come. I'd found peace, and for the first time, I felt genuinely grateful for the freedom I'd fought to create. This chapter of my life was finally closed. I was free to live on my terms, without the weight of my family's control pulling me back. And as I put down my pen, I realized that I was no longer defined by my family's demands. I was finally fully myself. I'm a 27-year-old guy, and I recently inherited my late grandfather's cabin. To give some context, my grandpa and I had a special bond. Growing up, I'd spend every summer at the cabin with him. We'd go fishing in the mornings, read old adventure books in the afternoons, and listen to his wild stories by the fireplace at night. He taught me how to tie knots, use a compass, and appreciate the simple things. It wasn't just a cabin, it was our little world. When my grandpa passed, he left the cabin to me specifically, citing that I was the one who truly appreciated it. My family was initially supportive. They even told me he made the right choice. My parents, aunts, uncles, and cousins all said they were happy the place stayed in the family, even if it wasn't theirs. I went through all the legal stuff, made sure the title was in my name, and everything was above board. After sorting the paperwork, I took my first solo trip to the cabin. It's a bit old and needed some fixing up, broken porch steps, a creaky door, and a leaky roof. Nothing I couldn't handle, though. I started documenting the repairs and posted a few updates on social media. You know, things like today, I replaced the porch steps. And check out this view from the cabin. People seem to enjoy the updates, especially my cousin Emily. She commented a lot, reminiscing about our childhood visits to the place. A few weeks later, she suggested it would be great to have a family gathering at the cabin, like the old times. I was hesitant. It's not a big place, and I wanted to keep it as a peaceful retreat, but I figured it would be nice to reconnect with family. So, I agreed. Emily came over first, saying she'd stay for a couple of nights. But her visit stretched into a week, and during that time, she started making all these comments, stuff like how it was strange that Grandpa left the cabin just to me, and how it would have been better if the whole family could have shared it. I brushed it off initially, thinking she didn't mean much by it. But then, during a family dinner at my parents' place, my uncle joked that I should be careful, or they might just take the cabin back. Everyone laughed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was some truth behind his words. A few days later, while cleaning out the cabin's attic, I found some old letters my grandpa had written. In one of them, he explained why he chose to leave the cabin to me. He said I was the only one who ever showed genuine interest in it. The rest of the family treated it like a vacation spot, but I treated it like a second home. That letter meant a lot to me, and I felt like I was honoring his wishes by keeping the cabin. But then the comments started rolling in. My aunt asked if I could host a big family reunion there. I turned her down, explaining that the place couldn't handle that many people, and that I wanted to keep it as a peaceful retreat. She didn't seem too happy with my answer, and soon after, my uncle called, offering to buy the cabin from me at a fair price. He kept talking about how it would be a great way to keep the cabin in the family. I declined, politely but firmly. Things really blew up in the family group chat after I posted about planning another solo weekend at the cabin. Emily called me selfish for hogging a place that meant a lot to the whole family. I tried explaining that it wasn't about keeping it to myself, it was about preserving what my grandpa wanted. That only seemed to make things worse. My other cousins started piling on, saying that I should be more considerate and that it's not fair to keep the cabin to myself. What really stung was when my mom called me later that night. She didn't outright say I was wrong, but she mentioned that the family was disappointed that I wasn't sharing the cabin with them. She said they felt like I was keeping them from their memories with Grandpa. I told her about the letter, how Grandpa wanted me to have it because of the bond we had, but she brushed it off, saying I was taking things too literally. Then came the part where my uncle made another offer, this time more direct. He suggested a specific price for the cabin. He said it would give me a nice little boost for my future plans. I could tell he thought I'd jump at the chance, but I just told him I wasn't interested in selling. He didn't take that too well, said I was being stubborn and that the whole family was starting to feel alienated. It was getting awkward. After that, I tried to keep my distance, but the tension kept building. I'd post another photo from the cabin, maybe of the newly painted porch or a sunrise over the lake, and like clockwork, I'd get snarky comments from Emily or one of my cousins. I found myself second-guessing everything I posted, wondering if I was rubbing it in their faces. But I wasn't going to give up the place that meant so much to me. I don't know, am I being unreasonable here? It feels like I'm just trying to honor my grandpa's wishes and enjoy a place that meant a lot to us. But now, it's like my whole family's turned against me. It's hard to keep the peace when everyone thinks I'm in the wrong for wanting to keep the cabin as my own. Update 1. After that initial blow-up with my family, I thought things might cool down. But it only got messier. My mom kept bringing up the same point whenever we spoke, how it's not fair for one person to keep the cabin when it's a family legacy. She even suggested that I should think about what Grandpa would have wanted. It felt like everyone was coming at me from all sides. Then, my uncle threw another wrench into the mix. During a family dinner at my parents' house, he mentioned that he had spoken to a lawyer friend who thought the will might not hold up if someone challenged it. He said it casually, almost like he was talking about the weather, but it was clear what he was hinting at. It made me nervous. Was he seriously thinking of challenging Grandpa's will? After that, I decided to seek my own legal advice. I reached out to a lawyer and laid everything out: my grandfather's will, the title transfer, and what my uncle had said. The lawyer reassured me that my grandpa's will was rock solid. He explained that my grandfather's intentions were clear, and that legally the cabin was mine. But he also warned me that family disputes could get ugly, even when the law is on your side. Things got even more tense at the next family gathering. My cousins, who used to be friendly, barely acknowledged me. It was like I had suddenly become an outsider. Even my aunt, who used to offer me leftovers to take home, didn't look my way. I could feel the cold shoulder from all sides. It made me realize that this whole situation had started to change the way my family saw me. Then Emily pulled a move I didn't expect. She posted on Facebook about how sad it is when some people put money above family values. It was pretty obvious who she was talking about, and she got a lot of sympathy from our extended relatives. People were commenting things like family is everything, and some people just don't get it. It stung, and it was clear she was turning people against me. One night, after a late shift at work, I came out to my car and found a note stuck under the windshield wiper. It was a plain piece of paper with a typed message: "The cabin belongs to the family, not you." It didn't say who it was from, but it made me feel uneasy. Up until then, I thought this was just a disagreement, but now it was starting to feel personal. That's when I decided to install some security cameras around the cabin. I picked up a few that send notifications directly to my phone if they detect movement. I figured it was better to be safe than sorry. I didn't want anyone messing with the property when I wasn't there. It didn't take long for the cameras to pick something up. One weekend, while I was back in the city, I got an alert on my phone. It was a video of my uncle wandering around the cabin's porch. He walked around the perimeter, looking in through the windows like he was inspecting the place. I watched the footage with a mix of anger and disbelief. The next time I saw him, I confronted him about it. He just shrugged it off, saying he was checking up on the property since I wasn't there. He made it sound like he was doing me a favor, but I wasn't buying it. I told him to stay away from the cabin unless he had my permission. He just smirked, like he knew something I didn't. things only got worse when I mentioned the incident in the family group chat. Instead of backing me up, most of my family sided with my uncle. They said he was just being responsible, and that I should be grateful he was looking out for the place. Emily chimed in again, saying I was being paranoid and making a big deal out of nothing. It felt like I was losing any hope of getting through to them. Then came another surprise. I drove up to the cabin one weekend, hoping for a quiet break, only to find my aunt and a couple of my cousins having a picnic on the front lawn. They had spread out a blanket and were acting like it was a public park. When I pulled up, they just waved casually like they hadn't crossed a line at all. I walked over and asked them what they were doing there, reminding them that the cabin was private property. My aunt rolled her eyes and said that it's as much ours as it is yours. She wasn't aggressive, but there was a challenge in her tone. It was awkward and tense, but eventually they packed up their stuff and left. As they were driving away, my aunt leaned out the window and told me I was being selfish. I could hear those words echoing in my head as I walked back into the cabin. Maybe she was right, maybe I was being paranoid. But the cameras, the note, my uncle's comments, it all added up to something that didn't feel right. It wasn't about me refusing to share. It was about boundaries, about respecting my grandpa's wishes. I talked to my best friend about the whole mess, and she gave me a reality check. She pointed out that my family was clearly overstepping. She reminded me that I had every right to set boundaries, especially when it came to a place that held so much personal value. She told me to stand firm and not let them push me around. It was a relief to hear someone say I wasn't in the wrong. That night, I decided to share everything on Reddit again. I posted about the incident with my uncle, the family picnic, and the note on my car. I asked people for advice on how to handle this situation without burning all my bridges. I wasn't sure what kind of response I'd get, but I hoped maybe someone out there had been through something similar. The comments started rolling in almost immediately, with a lot of people saying I wasn't crazy and that my family was trying to manipulate me. Some even suggested going no contact if things escalated. It was reassuring to know that others could see what I was dealing with, even if my family couldn't. Update 2. After I posted the last update, things kept spiraling. It started with my parents giving me the cold shoulder. They stopped inviting me to family events, no more Sunday dinners, no calls just to check in. It was like I'd become a stranger. I found out through Facebook that they were hosting a BBQ, and everyone was there except me. My mom's always been the one to remind me about family gatherings, but now it seemed like they were going out of their way to exclude me. Around the same time, my cousins started texting me. Some were sympathetic, saying they understood where I was coming from but wished I'd just let the cabin go. Others outright blamed me for the drama. They said I was being stubborn, and that I was tearing the family apart over a property. It felt like pressure from all sides, but I tried to stay focused on what I knew my grandpa would have wanted. Then came the call from my aunt. She was in tears, her voice cracking as she begged me to let the family use the cabin just for a few weekends. She said it would mean a lot to everyone, and that this whole mess could be over if I just compromise. I didn't want to be heartless, but I knew if I caved now, they'd keep pushing for more. I told her it wasn't going to happen, and the call ended awkwardly. It was clear she wasn't going to forgive me for that anytime soon. Not long after that, I got a letter in the mail. My uncle was officially challenging my grandfather's will. The grounds? He claimed there was undue influence, and that my grandpa wasn't mentally competent when he made his decision. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. I called my lawyer right away, and he assured me the case was weak. He said that it's common for families to make these kinds of claims when they're unhappy with a will. But he also warned me that even if it's weak, the process could drag out and become emotionally draining. My lawyer's warning proved to be right. The whole family, except for a few distant cousins I barely know, sided with my uncle. They framed it like I was the villain, the one keeping everyone from a piece of my grandpa's legacy. The story they were telling didn't match up with reality, but it was hard to change their minds. Suddenly, I was the bad guy in their eyes. Even my own parents seemed to buy into it, which stung the most, and the legal battle started taking its toll financially. I had some savings, but with all the fees piling up, it was clear I'd need more. I started looking at selling my car, trying to figure out how to make things work without losing everything. I even cut back on small things, like my weekly coffee runs, just trying to keep my head above water. It was frustrating. This place was supposed to be my peaceful escape, and now it was turning into a nightmare. One weekend when I drove up to the cabin, I found the side wall had been spray painted. The words "Family First" were scrawled across it in bright red. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It felt like a message, and not a subtle one. I called the local police and filed a report, but they couldn't do much without proof of who did it. They took some photos and told me they'd keep an eye out, but I could tell they didn't think it would go anywhere. I was left cleaning up the paint on my own, scrubbing the words off the cabin my grandpa loved so much. After that, I started having trouble sleeping. Every little noise at the cabin made me jump, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching. Even when I was back in my apartment, I felt like I was constantly looking over my shoulder. My lawyer told me to start documenting everything, every interaction with my family, every strange incident, just in case things got worse. So I did. I started keeping a notebook with dates, times, and details. Meanwhile, the support on Reddit kept me going. People flooded my post with messages of encouragement, telling me I wasn't crazy and that I needed to cut ties with my toxic family. Some shared their own stories of dealing with inheritance disputes, which made me feel less alone. It helped, knowing there were people out there who saw what I was going through and thought I was doing the right thing. But it didn't make the tension with my family any easier. I decided to set up a meeting with my parents, hoping I could reason with them. Maybe if I laid everything out, they'd see my side of things. We met up at a neutral spot, a small cafe in town. I brought copies of my lawyer's notes and the letters from my grandfather, thinking they'd understand if they just saw the facts. But the conversation didn't go the way I hoped. My parents mostly sat in silence while I talked. When they finally spoke, they echoed my uncle's arguments. They said it wasn't about the money, it was about keeping the family together and honoring Grandpa's memory. They made it sound like I was the one being selfish. I tried to explain that I wasn't trying to hurt anyone, but their minds were made up. At the end of the meeting, I made things clear. I told them that if they continued to support my uncle's legal action, I'd have no choice but to cut off contact. It wasn't a threat, it was just the reality of the situation. I couldn't keep putting myself through this. My mom looked like she might say something, but my dad just stood up and walked out. I watched them leave, feeling a knot in my stomach. I went straight home and updated my Reddit post, sharing everything that had happened, my parents siding with my uncle, the vandalism, the lawsuit. The support and advice came in fast, with people telling me to stay strong and protect myself. But I couldn't shake the feeling that things were only going to get messier from here. Update 3. After the last update, I thought things had hit rock bottom, but somehow, my family found new ways to make things even more complicated. Out of nowhere, one of my distant cousins reached out to me. She moved out of state years ago, so we hadn't really stayed in touch. She messaged me on Facebook, saying she'd seen the drama unfold online and couldn't believe how the rest of the family was acting. We ended up talking for hours. She told me that even before Grandpa got sick, he had always been worried about how the rest of the family would handle his estate. He thought they were too focused on what they could get out of him, rather than caring about the cabin itself. She said he used to tell her that I was the only one who truly appreciated the place for what it was, not just as a vacation spot, but as a home full of memories. Hearing that gave me a much-needed boost. It was like getting a reminder that I wasn't alone in all this, and that maybe I was doing the right thing by holding onto the cabin. Not long after that conversation, the first court hearing took place. My uncle's lawyer came out swinging, trying to paint this picture of my grandpa being too frail to make a clear decision when he wrote the will. But my lawyer had all the documents in order, including medical records showing that my grandpa was of sound mind when he made his choice. The judge dismissed a few of my uncle's claims, saying there wasn't enough evidence to back them up. It felt like a small victory, but I knew it was far from over. When my family heard about the court's initial decision, they didn't take it well. My mom blocked my number, and my dad sent me a handwritten letter. He wrote that I was no longer their daughter, and that I should think about what I was doing before I tore the family apart completely. It was brutal. I just stared at that letter for a long time before putting it away in the drawer. As if that wasn't enough, I started getting anonymous messages online, accusing me of destroying the family and calling me a gold digger. I have no idea if it was my cousins or just random people who somehow got wind of the situation, but it was unsettling. Some of the messages were aggressive, telling me to give back what isn't mine. I reported the accounts, but they just kept coming. I tried not to let it get to me. In a weird way, the negativity gave me a kind of determination to prove them wrong. My grandpa's words, the ones my cousins shared with me, kept ringing in my head. I couldn't let them twist this into something it wasn't. This wasn't about money. It was about honoring what my grandpa wanted and preserving the place that meant so much to both of us. One of the users on Reddit suggested I set up a GoFundMe to cover my legal costs. It was tempting, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. It felt too much like admitting defeat, like I needed help, because I couldn't handle this on my own. Instead, I focused on reading through the encouraging DMs I was getting from other Reddit users. A lot of people shared their own stories about family inheritance battles and dealing with toxic relatives. It helped to know that others had been through similar struggles and come out the other side. Then came another surprise. My uncle called me directly. He hadn't spoken to me one-on-one since this whole mess started. He offered to drop the lawsuit if I agreed to sell him the cabin for a fraction of what it was worth. He tried to make it sound like it was a win-win situation, but I knew better. He just wanted to get his hands on the cabin without going through the courts. I refused, and he didn't bother hiding his frustration. The call ended with a tense silence, and I knew there was no turning back now. A few days later, my parents showed up unannounced at my apartment. I hadn't seen them in person since the whole court case began, and they looked upset. My dad stood there with his arms crossed, and my mom had this desperate look on her face. They begged me to reconsider, saying that if I didn't, it would ruin the family forever. They brought up how much the cabin meant to everyone, and how this whole thing was tearing everyone apart. I listened to them, but I stood firm. I told them that my mind was made up, and that I wasn't going to change it. They left looking defeated, and I thought that was the end of it. But when I got back to my apartment door, I found a letter that my dad must have dropped on the doormat. It was another handwritten note, talking about how the cabin had been in the family for generations and how much it meant to my mom's parents and their parents before that. It was the kind of letter that tugged at your heartstrings, but I knew I had to hold my ground. With the final court date approaching, my lawyer called to say that we might have a shot at ending this sooner than expected. If the judge rules in our favor, this could all be over. I don't know if I should feel hopeful or just braced for whatever my family might throw at me next. I shared all of this in my latest Reddit post. The messages of support and advice poured in again. People reminded me that I wasn't alone and that standing up for what's right often comes at a cost. I'm trying to keep those words in mind as we head into the final stretch. Whatever happens, I just hope it brings some kind of closure for me and for everyone else. Update 4. The day of the final court hearing arrived, and I walked into that courtroom feeling the weight of everything that had led up to this moment. My uncle and his lawyer were there, looking confident, while my parents sat in the back, avoiding eye contact with me. My lawyer gave me a reassuring nod as we took our seats. The hearing was tense. My uncle's lawyer tried to hammer home the same old arguments about my grandpa's mental state when he wrote the will, but my lawyer countered with the documentation we'd gathered, including the medical reports and signed affidavits from grandpa's doctors. The judge listened to both sides, but it didn't take long for him to make a decision. He ruled in my favor, dismissing my uncle's claims entirely. My uncle's face went red, and he stormed out of the courtroom without looking back. My parents followed him out, not even glancing my way as they left. I stayed in the courtroom for a moment longer, trying to process what had just happened. It was over. I'd won, but it didn't feel like a victory. As I walked out of the courthouse, I got a message notification. It was from Emily. She congratulated me on the win, but added a stinging comment, "Hope it was worth losing everyone." I didn't reply, just stared at the screen for a while before turning my phone off. It felt like a parting shot, a final reminder that my family wasn't going to let this go. Later that evening, I got a few unexpected messages from some distant cousins. They apologized for how everything had gone down and said they didn't realize how bad things had gotten. A couple of them even offered to visit the cabin sometime. I wasn't sure if I could trust their intentions, especially after everything that had happened, so I kept the conversations polite but distant. That weekend, I headed up to the cabin, needing some time away from everything. I sat out on the porch with a cup of coffee, staring out at the lake that my grandpa and I used to fish in. The air was cool, the sun reflecting off the water like a mirror. For the first time in months, there was a sense of quiet, but it was mixed with a sadness that I couldn't ignore. I thought about my family, about how things had changed, and about what this place really meant to me. It was supposed to be a retreat, but now it was a reminder of everything I'd lost. When I shared the latest update on Reddit, I got a flood of support. People were congratulating me for standing my ground, telling me how proud my grandpa would have been. Some even shared stories of their own family disputes, which made me realize how common these situations could be. It was a strange comfort, knowing that I wasn't alone in facing this kind of fallout. A few days later, I decided to try reaching out to my mom. I thought maybe, now that the court case was over, we could start to rebuild some sort of relationship. I sent her a message, just a simple note saying I'd like to talk whenever she was ready. I waited for a response, but it never came. I guess I wasn't surprised, but it still hurt. It felt like a final confirmation that things between us wouldn't be the same again. With the legal battle behind me, I shifted my focus to fixing up the cabin. It was time to make it my own. I started small, painting the porch, replacing some old floorboards, fixing up the fireplace that had always been the heart of the cabin. It felt like a way to honor my grandpa's memory, a way to keep his spirit alive in the place he loved so much. A few weeks into the renovations, a Reddit user who had been following my updates reached out with an idea. They suggested starting a fundraiser to help cover the costs of fixing up the cabin. At first, I hesitated. I wasn't used to asking for help, and it felt awkward to accept money from strangers. But after some convincing, I agreed, and the response was overwhelming. People donated small amounts, but it added up quickly, enough to repair the cabin's roof and replace the old, creaky windows. I was beyond grateful for the support, and I made sure to post updates on how the work was coming along. But even though I'd won in court, the problems didn't completely disappear. One afternoon, I arrived at the cabin to find one of the windows broken. A few weeks later, I found my car tires slashed when I'd parked near the trailhead. I reported both incidents to the police, but without proof of who was behind it, there wasn't much they could do. It felt like someone was trying to send a message, but I wasn't going to let them scare me away. I upgraded the cabin's security system, adding more cameras and motion sensor lights around the property. It was frustrating, feeling like I had to be on guard all the time, but it was better than feeling unsafe in the place I wanted to call home. To cope with everything, I started seeing a therapist. I needed help processing the anxiety, the feeling of being betrayed by the people who were supposed to support me. The sessions helped. Little by little, I started to feel like I could breathe again, like I could find peace in the middle of all the chaos. While going through some of the old furniture in the cabin, I found a hidden compartment in my grandpa's desk. Inside were more letters from him, addressed to me. In those letters, he talked about how much he trusted me with the cabin and how he knew I'd take care of it the way he would have wanted. It was like hearing his voice again, reassuring me that I was on the right path. I shared what I believe will be my last update on Reddit, thanking everyone for their support and for sticking with me through this crazy journey. I told them that while I've lost a lot in this fight, I've gained a sense of self-respect and a clearer understanding of who I am. The cabin may be just a place, but it's also a piece of my grandpa's heart that I'll carry with me. And that, in the end, was worth all the battles. Update 5. It's been 6 months since the court ruled in my favor and a lot has changed. The cabin is almost unrecognizable from the state it was in when I first inherited it. I've replaced the leaky roof, installed new windows, and even put up a fresh coat of paint on the outside. It's a mix of modern comforts and the old charm that my grandpa loved so much. I've also started a small garden out front, nothing fancy, just some herbs and a few wildflowers. Watching things grow out here, with the lake as a backdrop, has become my little escape. Just when I thought things had settled down, my uncle made one last attempt to reach out. A letter arrived in the mail from him, written in a surprisingly calm tone. He suggested that we find a way to co-own the cabin, splitting the time between our families. He claimed it would be a way to move past the drama and make things right. I read the letter a couple of times before deciding. The answer was still no. I wrote back, keeping it short, telling him that I appreciated the offer but that I wasn't interested in any shared arrangement. I haven't heard from him since. My parents, though, have stayed completely distant. No calls, no messages, no visits. It's like we're strangers now. But after a lot of thinking, I decided to write them a letter. I didn't want to leave things as they were. I wrote about how much I missed them and how I hoped that someday we could find a way to rebuild what we'd lost. I didn't expect a response, and as of now, none has come. But at least I know I tried. I've been making the most of the cabin as a retreat. It's become a place where I can relax, invite a few close friends, and just enjoy the quiet. I even had my supportive cousin, the one who reached out when everything started going downhill, come up for a weekend. We sat by the fire, talked about old times, and shared stories about Grandpa. It felt like the start of a new chapter, one that wasn't defined by all the tension and hurt. One afternoon, I came back to the cabin from a run and found a bouquet of flowers on the front steps. There was an envelope with them, containing a short note that simply read, "I'm sorry." There wasn't a signature, and I have no idea who it was from. Maybe it was my uncle, maybe my mom, or maybe it was from one of my cousins who regretted how things turned out. Either way, I decided to take it as a sign that maybe, just maybe, someone out there realized how far things had gone. A few weeks ago, I decided to hold a small, private ceremony at the cabin. I took some of the letters my grandpa had written me, the ones I'd found hidden in his old desk, and buried them beneath a large oak tree near the lake. It was my way of honoring him and letting go of some of the pain from the past year. I sat there for a long time after, just listening to the wind rustling through the leaves. It was the first time in a while that I felt a sense of real peace. Out of the blue, Emily reached out again. This time, her message was more complicated. She admitted that she regretted how things had gone between us, but she couldn't let go of the anger she felt. She said that in some ways she understood why I held on to the cabin, but that it still felt wrong to her. I didn't know how to respond, so I thanked her for being honest and left it at that. It wasn't a resolution, but it was something. I decided to share some photos of the renovated cabin on Reddit. The response was overwhelming, with so many people commenting on how beautiful the place looked and how proud my grandpa would be. It was a good reminder of how far I'd come, from feeling like the whole world was against me to creating a space where I could truly breathe again. It also inspired me to do something I'd been thinking about for a while. I've started a small blog about life at the cabin. It's not much yet, just a few posts about the renovations, the small joys of living near the lake, and what I've learned about self-reliance. But it feels like a new purpose, a way to turn something painful into something positive. If sharing my story can help even one person find peace in nature, or get through a tough family situation, then it's worth it. Then, last week, something unexpected happened. My dad showed up at the cabin. I didn't see his car pull up, so I was surprised when I found him standing on the porch. It was awkward at first. We just stood there, not really knowing what to say. But eventually, I invited him inside, and we talked. We didn't solve everything, not by a long shot, but he told me that he missed me, and that despite everything, he wanted to try and understand my side of things. We talked for hours, going over old memories and all the things that had happened since Grandpa died. He didn't apologize, and I didn't expect him to. But there was a glimmer of hope that maybe someday we could start to mend things. When he left, I felt lighter, like the wall between us wasn't quite as high anymore. Looking back, it's hard to believe how much has changed in a year. I went from being scared to set boundaries with my family to finding strength in the solitude of the cabin. I've learned a lot about myself, about what matters, and about the kind of life I want to live. It hasn't been easy, and I know there's a long way to go, especially with my parents, but I'm ready to keep moving forward. I wrote what I believe will be my last update on Reddit, thanking everyone for their support throughout this journey. It's been a wild ride, but I'm ready to close this chapter and focus on the new one that's just beginning. While I've lost a lot along the way, I've found a sense of self-worth that I didn't know I had. And that's something I'll carry with me, no matter what happens next.